The wrestling legend has left behind a massive $220 million fortune, and you won't believe how it's being divided among his two children and two wives. In this video, we break down exactly who gets what from Hulk Hogan's incredible estate. When wrestling icon Hulk Hogan passed away, fans weren't just left mourning, they were left wondering, what happens to his massive $220 million empire? Stay with us as we dive deep into the real story behind Hulk Hogan's net worth, his will and estate plans, and the surprising beneficiaries who stand to inherit everything. From family drama to hidden assets, we reveal details you won't hear anywhere else. Under the dim glow of early morning television screens, news anchors across the country spoke the words wrestling fans hoped they would never hear: Hulk Hogan, the man who transcended the squared circle to become one of the most recognizable icons in sports entertainment, had passed away. For decades, his name was synonymous with charisma, power, and the golden era of wrestling. His larger-than-life persona, immortalized by the bandana, the handlebar mustache, and the booming catchphrases, had defined a generation. But now, beyond the tributes and the tears, a new question gripped the public's attention, and it wasn't about his matches, his rivalries, or his legacy in the ring. It was about his fortune. A staggering $220 million empire built over decades of relentless work, shrewd investments, and high-profile ventures. Who would inherit it? And, perhaps more importantly, who would be left out? The magnitude of Hulk Hogan's wealth was not simply a product of his wrestling salary. His career earnings from the WWE and WCW were substantial, yes, but his empire was the result of meticulous branding, decades of merchandise sales, television appearances, reality shows, endorsements, and a savvy ability to turn his name into a business. From action figures that flew off store shelves in the 80s to pay-per-view events that drew millions, Hogan understood that his fame could be monetized far beyond the confines of the ring. By the time of his passing, his assets included sprawling Florida estates, luxury vehicles, lucrative stock holdings, a chain of beachfront restaurants, and residual earnings from decades of licensing his image. But within hours of his death, whispers began to emerge from sources close to the family. The division of this massive fortune would not be straightforward. There were two children. There were two wives, one ex, one current. There were business partners and old friends who had been in his inner circle for decades. And there were clauses in his will that no one outside of Hogan's most trusted legal team had seen coming. When the initial probate documents began to surface, the wrestling world realized this was not going to be a typical celebrity estate story. The will, reportedly updated less than 2 years before his death, contained explicit instructions about how his wealth would be divided. Friends claimed Hogan had become meticulous about protecting his assets after a turbulent history with lawsuits, divorces, and financial settlements. Those close to him recall a conversation in which Hogan said, "I've built too much to see it torn apart in court when I'm gone." That sentiment was not just about preserving his net worth, it was about protecting the people he loved, even if that meant making difficult and controversial choices. At the heart of the will were his two children, Brooke and Nick Hogan. Both had grown up in the shadow of their father's fame, living much of their lives in the public eye. Brooke, the singer and reality TV star, had shared a close yet sometimes complicated relationship with her father. In recent years, however, the bond had reportedly strengthened, with Hogan attending her performances and publicly expressing pride in her ventures. Nick, on the other hand, had faced public scrutiny after a high-profile car accident in his early 20s that left a friend severely injured. Hogan had stood by him during the legal fallout, paying legal fees and ensuring his son had the resources to rebuild his life. It came as no surprise to those close to the family that both children were named as significant beneficiaries. But the way their shares were structured caught everyone off guard. According to insiders familiar with the estate, Brooke's inheritance was not simply a lump sum. Instead, Hogan had reportedly set up a trust that would provide her with substantial annual payments for life, along with access to certain properties and business interests. The trust was designed to protect the assets from potential business failures or personal challenges, ensuring that his daughter would always have financial stability. Nick's share was also placed in a trust, but with stricter stipulations, reportedly tied to his involvement in certain charitable ventures and restrictions on high-risk investments. Those close to Hogan suggest this wasn't a punishment, but rather a safeguard to ensure his son's financial security in the long term. It was, in the words of one confidant, Hogan's way of protecting his kids from the mistakes he knew they could make. Then there were the wives. His first wife, Linda Hogan, was perhaps the most controversial name connected to his fortune. Their divorce in 2009 had been one of the most public and financially draining celebrity splits of the era, with Linda reportedly walking away with a significant settlement that included property, vehicles, and a substantial sum of cash. Yet, despite the acrimonious nature of their split, sources close to Hogan say he never fully severed the emotional tie to Linda as the mother of his children. In a surprising twist, the will reportedly included a provision granting Linda a portion of his residual earnings from certain merchandising and licensing deals. While this share was nowhere near the scale of his children's inheritance, it was enough to raise eyebrows and questions. Some interpreted it as a final gesture of gratitude. Others saw it as an attempt to prevent legal battles from erupting between Linda and the other beneficiaries. Hogan's second wife, Jennifer, entered his life years later, during what friends describe as a period of peace and personal reinvention for the wrestling legend. The two had kept much of their relationship away from the tabloids, but those who knew them said Jennifer had been a steady presence in his later years, supporting him through health scares and the physical toll left by decades in the ring. In the will, Jennifer's share was described as both generous and immediate, including primary ownership of Hogan's main residence in Clearwater, Florida, as well as a substantial portion of his liquid assets. She was also granted control over certain business entities, a decision that some insiders believe could cause friction with other beneficiaries. One former business partner remarked, "Control is where the real power is, and Hogan knew exactly what he was doing when he gave her that." The estate wasn't just cash, property, and investments. Hogan's legacy also included a vault of wrestling memorabilia worth millions on its own. Championship belts, ring-worn gear, rare promotional posters, and even unreleased footage from his wrestling days were all cataloged and appraised. For wrestling fans, these items were priceless. For the estate, they represented a substantial asset that needed to be managed carefully. In a move that stunned collectors, Hogan's will reportedly stipulated that a portion of this memorabilia be donated to a wrestling museum, a project he had quietly been supporting for years. The remainder would be auctioned off, with the proceeds split among his children and select charities, including those focused on children's hospitals and veterans organizations. This decision underscored a side of Hogan the public rarely saw: the philanthropist who believed in giving back to the communities that had supported him. But the most surprising element of the will came in the form of what Hogan left to his closest friends and business partners. Among the beneficiaries were a handful of names that only hardcore fans and industry insiders would recognize: longtime trainers, former tag team partners, and behind-the-scenes crew members who had been with him since his early days in wrestling. These individuals were reportedly gifted significant cash sums, as well as lifetime royalties from certain Hogan-branded merchandise. One friend described it as Hogan's way of making sure the guys who helped build Hulkamania never had to worry again. As news of the will's details began to leak, public reaction was swift and divided. Fans praised Hogan's generosity toward friends and his commitment to preserving wrestling history. Others speculated that certain provisions, particularly those involving Linda and Jennifer, could spark legal disputes. Family law experts noted that even the most carefully drafted wills can become battlegrounds when high-value estates are involved. And with a fortune as massive as $220 million, the potential for conflict was almost inevitable. Already, unnamed sources close to the situation were telling tabloid outlets that tensions were brewing behind the scenes, particularly over the management of Hogan's business holdings. For now, though, the public knew only part of the story. The true scope of Hogan's fortune and the full extent of his final wishes would unfold over the coming months as the probate process continued. What was clear, however, was that Hulk Hogan had crafted a will that reflected not only his wealth, but his values. He had balanced family loyalty with practical safeguards, generosity with foresight, and nostalgia with a forward-looking vision for his legacy. In doing so, he ensured that his name and his fortune would live on, not just in the memories of wrestling fans, but in the lives of those he chose to protect and provide for. And for a man who built an empire on the idea of immortality in the ring, perhaps that was the most fitting legacy of all. By the time the legal proceedings officially began, reporters were camped outside the courthouse, their cameras trained on every person connected to Hogan's inner circle. From the polished suits of his attorneys to the quiet arrivals of family members, the world watched as the first official hearings opened the vault, literally and figuratively, on one of the most talked-about celebrity estates in recent memory. What they would find inside would not only confirm some of the rumors, but reveal twists no one saw coming. Because while Hogan's fortune was vast, it was the way he chose to divide it that would leave a mark as lasting as any championship belt he ever held, and that, as sources hinted, was only the beginning of the battle over Hulk Hogan's $220 million empire. The first week after Hulk Hogan's passing was a blur of headlines, tributes, and shock. For wrestling fans, the loss was personal, the kind of gut punch that felt like losing a family member. But behind the tribute packages playing on sports networks and the nostalgic montages flooding social media, a far more complicated narrative was unfolding in conference rooms, law offices, and private phone calls. The $220 million fortune Hogan had left behind wasn't simply sitting in a bank account, waiting to be divided with a handshake and a smile. It was tangled up in trusts, business contracts, intellectual property rights, and perhaps most dangerous of all, decades of family history that carried both love and resentment in equal measure, inside a sleek, glass-walled law firm in downtown Tampa. The first official reading of Hogan's will was set to take place. Those invited had been carefully selected according to the strict instructions laid out by Hogan himself months before his death. The list was short, and the tension was thick. Brooke Hogan arrived first, wearing dark sunglasses and a black pantsuit, her long hair pulled back. She avoided the cameras outside, slipping in through a private entrance. Her brother Nick followed not long after, his demeanor far more casual, but his expression tight, betraying a nervousness he couldn't quite mask. Their mother, Linda Hogan, arrived separately, accompanied by her attorney, a sign that whatever was about to happen would not be taken at face value. Jennifer, Hogan's second wife, was last to enter, dressed in a conservative black dress, her face pale but composed. The room itself was pristine, almost sterile. No memorabilia, no photographs, no sign that the man whose legacy loomed over the proceedings had spent his life in a world of bright lights and roaring crowds. Instead, there was a long polished table, a stack of legal documents, and a single framed portrait of Hogan placed at the head of the table by one of his attorneys. A small nod to the man whose absence was the reason they were all there. As the estate lawyer, a measured man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, took his seat, the murmurs stopped. He cleared his throat and began to read. The first part was straightforward: Hogan's charitable bequests. Several hospitals, veterans organizations, and youth sports programs would receive donations totaling millions of dollars, drawn from a special fund Hogan had established years earlier. This was met with quiet nods. No one in the room could object to his well-documented generosity toward causes close to his heart. But as the lawyer moved deeper into the will, the atmosphere shifted. Brooke was named first among the family beneficiaries. Her trust would be funded with a substantial portion of Hogan's liquid assets, estimated at over $50 million, alongside joint ownership of certain real estate holdings, including a luxury condo in Miami and a lakeside property in Orlando. However, the terms of her trust were explicit: annual disbursements, investment oversight by a financial trustee, and a stipulation that she maintain involvement in Hogan's charitable foundation for a minimum of 10 years. Brooke's face softened slightly as she listened. This was more than money, it was a role in preserving her father's name. Nick's share was next, and it carried a noticeably different structure. His trust would receive roughly $35 million, with access to certain investment accounts and one of Hogan's prized classic car collections. But his funds were locked behind performance-based stipulations. At least half of his annual allowance would be contingent upon his participation in community programs, public speaking events, and a clean legal record. The conditions drew a visible reaction from Nick, a subtle shake of the head, a flash of irritation that was quickly hidden. Hogan's lawyer paused, as if to let the weight of those clauses settle in the room. Then came the section that had the potential to ignite a firestorm, the provisions for Hogan's wives. Linda's share was modest compared to the others, but surprising nonetheless. In addition to a lump sum payment of $5 million, she was granted a lifetime royalty on certain merchandising rights, a percentage of profits from classic Hulkamania, products that continued to sell decades after their peak. Jennifer's portion was larger, reflecting her status as Hogan's spouse at the time of his death. She would receive ownership of the Clearwater Mansion, valued at nearly $15 million, control over several active business ventures, and a direct payout of $20 million in liquid assets. Furthermore, she was designated as the executor of Hogan's personal brand management, giving her influence over the use of his likeness, merchandise, and future licensing deals. When the lawyer read that final part aloud, the room's temperature seemed to drop. Brooke shifted in her seat, glancing at Jennifer, while Linda's attorney began scribbling notes furiously. Nick leaned back, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the table. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about power. Control of the Hogan brand meant control over the narrative of his legacy, the direction of posthumous projects, and the long-term revenue streams that could generate millions for decades to come. The lawyer continued, outlining Hogan's instructions for his wrestling memorabilia. His most valuable items, including championship belts, custom ring gear, and a private collection of rare wrestling footage, were to be appraised and partially donated to a wrestling museum, with the remainder auctioned off. The proceeds would be split between Brooke, Nick, and 2 charities. Additionally, several personal items were left to longtime friends and colleagues in the wrestling industry. These bequests were deeply personal. An original Hulkamania banner to one friend who had been with him since his first big match, a gold chain to a trainer who had mentored him during his WCW years. Each gift was accompanied by a handwritten note from Hogan, stored in sealed envelopes to be opened privately. The reading concluded, but no one moved. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the awareness that the next steps would be just as delicate as the words they'd just heard. When the lawyer finally looked up, he spoke with a calm finality. Mr. Hogan was clear in his intentions. My role is to ensure they are carried out exactly as written. I trust each of you will respect his wishes. Outside that room, however, respect would be tested almost immediately. Within days, whispers began to circulate. Rumors of disputes over valuations, disagreements about the control of Hogan's businesses, and questions about whether certain assets had been moved into private holdings to keep them outside the will's jurisdiction. One source close to the family claimed that Hogan had quietly transferred ownership of a beachfront property in California to a trust managed by a longtime friend just months before his death, a move that could complicate the estate's accounting. Another hinted that Linda might challenge the validity of the will based on changes made during Hogan's marriage to Jennifer. In Clearwater, paparazzi staked out the gates of Hogan's mansion, hoping to capture any sign of family members coming or going. Brooke remained silent publicly, but her social media posts hinted at a protective stance over her father's legacy. Nick was seen meeting with friends at a local restaurant, his mood unreadable. Linda gave a brief statement to a celebrity news outlet, calling Hogan's passing the end of an era, but stopping short of commenting on her share of the estate. Jennifer, meanwhile, maintained a low profile, reportedly meeting with Hogan's business managers to begin transitioning control of his brand. Behind closed doors, the negotiations began. Though the will was legally binding, the sheer complexity of Hogan's assets meant that interpretation was inevitable, and in high-stakes estates, interpretation often meant leverage. Appraisals of his memorabilia, valuations of his active businesses, and estimates of future brand revenue all became points of contention. For every dollar tied to an asset, there was someone willing to argue over its true worth. And as those discussions unfolded, the fragile alliances between family members began to fray, but perhaps the most shocking revelation was still to come. Deep within Hogan's estate plan, buried in a section few had paid attention to during the reading, was a clause that gave him the ability to alter certain beneficiary allocations through a separate, confidential letter stored with his personal attorney. This letter, dated just 6 months before his death, was about to surface, and its contents would shift the balance of Hogan's $220 million fortune in ways no one in that Tampa conference room could have predicted. The discovery of the letter sent a ripple of unease through everyone tied to Hulk Hogan's estate. It hadn't been read aloud at the initial meeting. The will had acknowledged its existence, but the language was vague, calling it a confidential directive that would take precedence over certain allocations if found in good legal standing. For days, the family didn't know what it contained. Then, on a humid Friday morning in Tampa, Hogan's longtime personal attorney, a discreet figure who had represented him for nearly 3 decades, confirmed that the letter was real and that it would now be unsealed. The meeting to reveal its contents was far smaller than the original will reading. Only the direct beneficiaries were present: Brooke, Nick, Linda, and Jennifer, along with 2 neutral witnesses and the attorney himself. The air was tense enough to cut with a blade. Outside, a small army of reporters gathered on the sidewalk, their cameras fixed on the law office door. They couldn't see inside, but they could sense that something seismic was about to happen. The attorney, his voice calm but deliberate, began by explaining the purpose of the letter. Mr. Bolia, he used Hogan's real surname, intended this as a personal addendum to his will, to be kept private until all immediate arrangements following his death had been made. The instructions here are clear, but they may come as a surprise to some of you. His eyes scanned the table, lingering briefly on each face before he broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick cream-colored paper. Hogan's handwriting filled the page, large, deliberate strokes, with words underlined for emphasis. The letter began with a note about legacy, how he wanted his fortune to be more than numbers on a page, and how he believed that money, without purpose, was just paper. He spoke about how fame had given him everything but had also taken things from him, and how he wanted to ensure his wealth carried meaning long after the headlines faded. Then, without much build-up, came the first bombshell. Hogan was reallocating a portion of Brooks and Nick's trust funds, not reducing them entirely, but diverting $20 million from each into a new foundation called the Hogan Legacy Trust. The trust's mission was to fund wrestling scholarships, medical care for retired athletes with no insurance, and youth mentorship programs. Brooke's head snapped up when she heard the figure. Nick's jaw visibly tightened. This wasn't a small charitable donation. This was a seismic redirection of money they had already assumed would be theirs. The second shock came in the form of an unorthodox gift. Hogan had granted his ex-wife, Linda, a 10% stake in the ongoing revenue from the Hogan Legacy Trust's brand licensing. A move designed, he explained in the letter, to ensure she remained tied to the family name and the work we continue, rather than estranged from it. Linda blinked in disbelief, the corner of her mouth twitching into a smile that she quickly tried to hide. Jennifer, sitting 2 seats away, shifted uncomfortably. Then came the part that made Jennifer's grip on the table tighten. In the letter, Hogan acknowledged the Clearwater Mansion and the business entities he had left to her in the will, but he added a caveat: control over the Hogan brand's future licensing deals would not rest solely in her hands. Instead, it would be managed jointly by her, Brooke, and a trusted business partner from Hogan's past, a man known only as Jimmy in the public wrestling world, but whose real name was in the letter. This was the same partner who had helped Hogan negotiate some of his most lucrative contracts in the late 90s. Jennifer's face hardened. This was a quiet but unmistakable check on her authority. The final pages of the letter contained something no one saw coming. Hogan had set aside $15 million in a separate, undisclosed account to be distributed in secret cash gifts to 6 individuals whose names were listed in block letters. They were not family. They were not public figures. They were men and women who had, according to Hogan, been there in the shadows when I had nothing left to give. One was a trainer who had once loaned Hogan money to pay his mortgage during a rough period. Another was a hospital nurse who had cared for him after multiple back surgeries. A third was a small-town promoter who had booked Hogan in his first paying wrestling match. These were debts of gratitude paid in full, long after the world had forgotten these people existed. The room was silent as the attorney finished reading. Hogan's words, personal, blunt, and utterly unfiltered, seemed to hang in the air like thick smoke. Brooke looked torn, her loyalty to her father's wishes fighting with the sudden awareness that tens of millions of dollars she had counted on were now being redirected. Nick was less subtle. He muttered something under his breath and leaned back, his frustration radiating. Linda appeared almost satisfied, as though the letter had vindicated her in some way. Jennifer's expression was harder to read, a mix of hurt and calculation, the look of someone recalibrating her strategy in real time. When the attorney folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, he reminded them that while this was an emotional moment, the letter had the same legal standing as the will. Mr. Balia's wishes are binding, he said firmly. This is not open to debate in this room. How you handle it outside of here is up to you, but I urge you to remember that his goal was to unite this family in his absence, not divide it further. Outside the building, the cameras clicked wildly as the beneficiaries emerged. Brooke kept her head down, walking briskly to a waiting car. Nick didn't say a word, but the set of his jaw told the press everything they needed to know. Linda, ever the media veteran, offered a quick, non-committal "it was what he wanted" before ducking into her SUV. Jennifer walked out last, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her posture upright but tense. Within hours, news of the letter leaked, not the full contents, but enough to set the internet ablaze. Headlines blared about the $40 million diverted from Hogan's children to charity. Talk shows speculated about why Linda had been given a stake in the brand's revenue. Wrestling forums buzzed with theories about the mysterious Jimmy who now shared control of the Hogan empire. Public opinion split down the middle. Some hailed Hogan as a visionary for turning his wealth into a force for good. Others accused him of undermining his own family in the name of public image. Behind the scenes, the letter's fallout was immediate. Brooke, torn between her love for her father and her concern for her own financial security, reached out to Jennifer to discuss how they might work together on brand management. Nick, however, began quietly consulting with lawyers about whether the letter could be challenged on the grounds of undue influence, though no one could say who he thought had influenced it. Linda's attorneys began digging into the trust structure, looking for any legal avenues that could expand her share. And the 6 mysterious beneficiaries listed in Hogan's secret account were about to receive life-changing phone calls that would pull them, unwillingly, into the media spotlight. The first to be contacted was the nurse, now retired, living in a modest home in Clearwater. She was stunned when an attorney arrived at her door with a sealed envelope and a message. "This is from Terry. He said you'd know what it means." Inside was a letter in Hogan's handwriting, thanking her for treating me like a man, not a headline when he was at his lowest. The check enclosed was for $2.5 million. She sat at her kitchen table for nearly an hour before calling her daughter to tell her the news, and that was just one of 6 stories about to unfold, stories that would reveal a side of Hulk Hogan the world had rarely seen. And that would turn the battle over his $220 million fortune into something far more human and far more unpredictable. The shockwaves from Hogan's secret letter hadn't even begun to settle when the ripple effect reached the wider public. For the 6 unexpected beneficiaries, the revelation was as surreal as it was life-altering. Until that point, most of them had never been mentioned in any wrestling magazine, documentary, or interview. They weren't part of the glamorous, high-octane world of Hulkamania. They were the people who had quietly passed through Hogan's life at pivotal moments and left an impression deep enough for him to immortalize them in his final act. The second name on that list belonged to a man named Raymond Ray Hollister, a former small-town wrestling promoter from Venice, Florida. In 1978, before Hogan was the immortal Hulk Hogan, he was just Terry Bollea, a giant with promise, playing bass guitar in local bands and trying to make ends meet while training for the ring. Ray was the one who took a chance on him, booking him on a regional wrestling card for a meager $50, but paying him $300 out of his own pocket after the event because the kid worked like he was already headlining Madison Square Garden. The check Hogan left him in his will was for $3 million. When a reporter caught Ray outside his modest home after news of the letter leaked, he said only, "I never thought I'd hear from him again." I guess he never forgot. Then there was Frances Fran Miller, an 82-year-old retired physical therapist from Miami. She met Hogan in the late 80s after a severe knee injury nearly derailed his career. At the time, Hogan was under enormous pressure from promoters to return to the ring, but Fran convinced him to slow down and rebuild his strength safely. He said, "I saved his career," Fran recalled to a local news outlet, her voice trembling, "but all I did was tell him to listen to his body." Hogan's check to her was for $2 million, along with a handwritten note that read, "You kept me walking, you kept me wrestling, and you kept me dreaming." The list continued. A high school janitor named Sam Bowers, who had let Hogan use the school's weight room at night when he was struggling to find a place to train. A Navy veteran named Carl Weaver, who had once pulled Hogan out of a bar fight before it escalated into a legal nightmare. And a former hotel bellhop named Jorge Castillo, who had returned Hogan's lost duffel bag in 1995 containing $40,000 in cash and several pieces of championship memorabilia. Each received multi-million-dollar bequests and a letter that spoke directly to the moment they had helped him. The sixth and final recipient was perhaps the most controversial. Her name was Stephanie Cole, a former ring announcer who had worked briefly in WCW and was rumored, years ago, to have been close to Hogan during one of his separations from Linda. She had long since disappeared from the wrestling scene, moving to Arizona and living a quiet life. The letter Hogan left her was brief, "For being my friend when I was lonely, and for telling me the truth when no one else would." Her check was for $5 million. Within hours of her name becoming public, social media erupted with speculation about her relationship with Hogan. Family members, already strained by the contents of the will, saw Stephanie's inclusion as gasoline poured onto an already smoldering fire. By the end of the week, the media frenzy around these 6 beneficiaries had reached a fever pitch. Morning shows dissected their stories, online forums spun conspiracy theories, and tabloids ran grainy photos from decades past, trying to tie each name to Hogan's larger-than-life narrative. But for Brooke and Nick, the optics were becoming dangerous. Every headline about millions being given to people outside the family fed the perception that they had been slighted. Nick, in particular, began to see legal action as not just an option, but a necessity. The first cracks in the family's fragile posthumous truce appeared during a tense, closed-door meeting between Brooke, Nick, and Jennifer. The meeting was meant to discuss how they would jointly manage the Hogan brand moving forward, per the terms of the letter. But Nick arrived late, already agitated, with a folder of legal documents under his arm. He wasted no time. "I'm telling you both now, I'm challenging that letter." Dad was not in the right frame of mind when he signed it. Too many changes, too close to the end. "It's not binding." Jennifer leaned forward, her tone controlled but firm. "Nick, that letter is ironclad. He wrote it himself. He had it notarized. He wanted those changes." "Wanted?" Nick shot back. "Or was talked into it. There's a difference." His gaze flicked to Jennifer in a way that made his implication clear. Brooke, caught between her brother and her father's widow, tried to play peacemaker. "Nick, even if you could challenge it, what would that do? Drag Dad's name through the mud in court? That's not what he'd want." But Nick wasn't swayed. "You think he'd want us sitting here while strangers get millions and we get conditions like we're kids on allowance?" That meeting ended without resolution, but the tension was now an open wound. Within days, Nick's legal team filed preliminary paperwork to contest the letter's authority in probate court, citing possible undue influence and disparity in beneficiary treatment. While legal experts on TV pointed out that contesting such a document was notoriously difficult, the move signaled to everyone, including the press, that the fight over Hogan's $220 million was about to become public and ugly. The court battle drew even more attention when Linda Hogan announced she would also be filing a motion, not to overturn the will or letter, but to demand a clarification of her rights to brand licensing revenue. Her attorneys argued that the letter's language about her stake was too vague and could be interpreted in a way that severely limited her income. This put her at direct odds with Jennifer, who saw any expansion of Linda's rights as a direct threat to her control over the brand. And then, as if the family drama wasn't enough, one of the 6 surprise beneficiaries, Stephanie Cole, agreed to a televised interview. Sitting across from a primetime news anchor, Stephanie addressed the speculation about her relationship with Hogan head-on. "Yes, we were close. Yes, we spent time together when he was going through a lot. But this money isn't about romance or secrets. It's about friendship. He wanted to thank me, and I didn't even know until the letter was read." Her calm, measured delivery did little to quiet the gossip, but it made her seem more sympathetic to the public. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom became the stage for a battle that was part legal chess match, part tabloid spectacle. Cameras swarmed the courthouse steps every morning. Inside, the arguments over Hogan's intentions, the legality of the letter, and the true value of his assets dragged on for hours at a time. Family members avoided each other in the hallways, communicating only through their attorneys. Every so often, a new document would surface, a handwritten note, a signed contract, a bank statement, each one adding fuel to the fire. Through it all, the wrestling world watched with a mix of fascination and sadness. To the fans, Hogan had always been the ultimate hero, the man who told you to say your prayers and take your vitamins. Now, in death, his name was being pulled into a bitter family war that seemed destined to leave scars no amount of money could heal. And yet, somewhere within this chaos, the Hogan Legacy Trust quietly began its work, funding the first scholarships for young wrestlers, covering medical bills for retired athletes, and showing that even amid all the noise, some part of Hogan's vision was still alive, but the storm was far from over. A bombshell motion filed by Jennifer's legal team hinted that Hogan had recorded a private video message just weeks before his death, a message that, according to her lawyers, would definitively settle his intentions for the estate. Whether that message would save the family from tearing itself apart or shatter what little peace remained was anyone's guess. The leak about the existence of a private video from Hulk Hogan hit the press like a thunderclap. Until that point, everything about the battle for his $220 million empire had been fought on paper, wills, letters, and sworn statements. But the notion that Hogan himself had spoken directly to camera, just weeks before his death, shifted the energy of the entire case. It was no longer just a fight over interpretations of words written months earlier. This was potentially his last living testimony, the voice of the man whose fortune and name were at the center of the storm. The footage, according to Jennifer's legal team, had been recorded in his Clearwater home office on a rainy Sunday afternoon. The timestamp showed it was filmed exactly 19 days before Hogan's death. In it, he addressed the camera alone, with no attorney present, no script in hand, wearing a black bandana and a simple t-shirt that read, "Train. Say your prayers. Eat your vitamins." The court ordered the video to be played in a closed session first, allowing only the immediate family, their attorneys, and the judge to watch. The room was silent except for the soft click of the screen coming to life. Hogan leaned forward in his chair, his voice lower and slower than the booming promos fans were used to. "If you're seeing this, brother, it means I'm not around anymore. And I know there's gonna be a lot of noise about what I left, who gets what, and why. So let me lay it out, plain and simple." He spoke first about his children, looking straight into the lens when he addressed Brooke and Nick by name. He explained that the trusts weren't punishments, but protections. He talked about watching other athletes blow their fortunes and said he wasn't about to set my kids up for a crash and burn. Brooke, you're steady. You know how to make a dollar last. Nick, you've had your moments, but I believe you can rise above them. This trust? It's not a leash. It's a ladder. He then addressed Linda, acknowledging their turbulent past, but also crediting her for being there in the beginning when there wasn't much but a dream and a prayer. He explained the royalties she'd been given were meant to ensure she could stay tied to the brand for life, because that brand is part of you too. When he shifted to Jennifer, there was a noticeable pause. His voice softened, almost as if he knew what giving her control would mean after he was gone. Jennifer, you've been my rock these last years. You're the one who saw me at my weakest and didn't flinch. That's why you've got the keys to keep this thing moving. But I'm not blind, I know you're gonna need help. That's why Brooke and Jimmy are in there with you. This isn't about control. It's about keeping the ship steady. Then came the part that had fueled so much of the public drama, the 6 surprise beneficiaries. One by one, Hogan read their names aloud, explaining the moments in his life they had stepped up for him, moments most of the world had never known about. His tone was unapologetic. These people? They're family too. Not by blood, but by the way they showed up when it mattered. And if anybody's got a problem with that, then you've forgotten what loyalty really means. Finally, Hogan leaned back, sighed, and delivered a message that cut through the legal jargon, the speculation, and the bitterness that had been building for weeks. This ain't about who wins and who loses. It's about making sure Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, means something when I'm gone. I built an empire with my hands, my back, and my name, and I'm giving it to the people I trust to protect it. If you can't work together to do that, then everything I built dies with me. When the video ended, the silence in the room was crushing. Brooke wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Nick stared at the table, his jaw tense, his earlier bravado shaken. Linda sat back in her chair, expression unreadable. Jennifer kept her gaze forward, her grip on her armrest tightening, as though holding herself in place. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell. This video, he said, makes clear the decedent's intent. Unless substantial evidence to the contrary is brought forward, it will be considered binding in alignment with the will and the letter. Word of the video's contents spread like wildfire within hours. Though the court had banned recordings, multiple attendees leaked descriptions to the press. News outlets ran segments describing it as Hogan's final promo, not for wrestling, but for peace. Wrestling fans, hearing the quotes, flooded social media with tributes, some even calling it the most important speech of his career. Public sympathy began to shift. Challenging his wishes now risked looking like a betrayal of the man himself. Behind the scenes, Nick's legal team scrambled. The video made their undue influence argument harder to prove. Brooke, while still protective of her own future, began urging her brother to reconsider dragging the fight out. Even Linda, who had been maneuvering for a bigger piece of the licensing pie, realized that pushing too hard might backfire in the court of public opinion. But not everyone was ready to back down. One of Hogan's oldest business associates, a man who had not been included in the will or the letter, emerged with a claim that threatened to blow the estate wide open again. He alleged that he was entitled to a cut of Hogan's posthumous brand earnings based on a decades-old handshake agreement, and he had paperwork he claimed could prove it. The court had just begun to steady after the video. Now, it was bracing for a new round of chaos, one that could drag on for months and pull even more of Hogan's past into the harsh glare of the public spotlight. The man who stepped forward called himself more than just an old friend. He called himself the architect of Hulk Hogan's rise. His name was Vince VJ Jensen, a grizzled 72-year-old with a weathered face, slicked-back silver hair, and a voice like gravel dragged over concrete. To most of the wrestling world, he was a ghost from the past, someone who had been around in the late 70s and early 80s, but disappeared before Hogan truly became a household name. But to those who knew the inner workings of the Florida wrestling scene, VJ was remembered as the guy who claimed to have discovered Hogan before Vince McMahon Sr. ever booked him for Madison Square Garden, and now, after decades of silence, VJ walked into the probate courthouse with a manila folder tucked under his arm, announcing to reporters that he was here to collect what's rightfully mine. According to Jensen's claim, back in 1979, he and Hogan, then still going by Terry Bollea, had signed an informal partnership agreement. In it, Jensen alleged, the two men had agreed to split any profits from Hogan's wrestling name, likeness, and related merchandise down the middle for life, even if they stopped working together. The paperwork he carried was old, typed on yellowed paper, and bore what appeared to be Hogan's early signature. This was before the bandana, before the red and yellow, Jensen told a swarm of cameras. When he was just a big kid with a dream and no clue how to get there, I put my time, my money, and my name on the line for him. And he promised me 50-50 forever. He may be gone, but that promise doesn't die. Inside the courtroom, the reaction was electric. Hogan's legal team immediately challenged the authenticity of the document. The estate's lead attorney, flanked by Jennifer and Brooke, argued that no such agreement had ever been honored or recognized in any of Hogan's official business dealings, and that even if the signature was genuine, any claim from the 1970s was long past the statute of limitations. But Jensen's attorney pushed back hard, claiming that Hogan had continued to verbally acknowledge the agreement over the years, even cutting Jensen quiet payments off the books in cash for decades. Then came the part that made the entire room lean forward. Jensen claimed to have audio recordings, taped phone calls from as recently as 2015, in which Hogan allegedly discussed keeping our deal alive and promised to make sure you get your cut when I'm gone. If the recordings were real, they could blow a hole in the carefully constructed estate plan and divert a massive slice of the brand's posthumous revenue directly into Jensen's hands. The judge, visibly wary of turning the probate case into a circus, ordered the recordings to be turned over under seal for review. That didn't stop details from leaking within 48 hours. A source close to the court claimed that in one of the tapes, Hogan's voice could be heard saying, "Don't worry, brother, when the big payday comes, you'll be taken care of. That's how we started, and that's how we'll finish." Whether that was just friendly banter or an enforceable commitment was now the question that could define the rest of the case. Meanwhile, the family's patience began to fray. Brooke, who had been working cautiously with Jennifer to manage the brand under the letter's terms, saw Jensen's claim as a direct threat not just to her inheritance, but to the stability of the Hogan Legacy Trust. Nick, who had been on the verge of withdrawing his challenge after seeing the video, now felt emboldened again. "This just proves Dad didn't have everything locked down," he told a friend, according to a leak to the Tampa Tribune. "If this guy wins, what's stopping anyone else from crawling out of the woodwork?" The public loved the drama. Sports talk shows devoted entire segments to Hulk Hogan's hidden deal, with former wrestlers weighing in on whether VJ Jensen was telling the truth or chasing a payday. Old photographs surfaced of the two men together in dusty Florida gyms, standing side by side with their arms crossed, looking more like outlaw bikers than future sports entertainment legends. And then, in a twist that made the family's stomach drop, Jensen's attorney announced that they had located two more witnesses who could testify that they'd heard Hogan reaffirm the deal as recently as 2018. One was a retired wrestler who had been on the same convention circuit as Hogan. The other was a former tour manager who handled appearances for both men in the early 2000s. Their statements, filed with the court, claimed Hogan had introduced Jensen more than once as "my original partner in all this, the guy who'll get his piece when I cash out." For Jennifer, this wasn't just a legal problem, it was a public relations nightmare. Control over the Hogan brand meant controlling its image, and the idea that Hogan had left behind a secret partner who had been promised half the action was making sponsors nervous. A licensing deal for a new line of Hogan-branded fitness equipment was suddenly put on pause until the estate could assure the company that Jensen's claim wouldn't derail their profits. The tension boiled over one rainy afternoon in the courthouse hallway when Jennifer, leaving a closed-door meeting with her attorneys, came face-to-face with Jensen. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jensen broke into a slow smile. You know this is bigger than you, right? Bigger than all of you. Without me, there wouldn't be a Hulk Hogan. Jennifer didn't flinch. And without him, she replied coldly, you'd still be running shows in bingo halls. They stared each other down until court officers stepped between them. The judge scheduled a special evidentiary hearing to determine whether Jensen's claim had enough merit to move forward. If the court found it credible, Jensen could be entitled to a share of Hogan's posthumous earnings, potentially tens of millions of dollars, for the rest of his life. If not, his case would be dismissed, and the estate would move on. But before that hearing could even begin, another leak hit the press. One suggesting that Jensen wasn't the only figure from Hogan's past preparing to file a claim. An unnamed former business partner from Hogan's early merchandising days had reportedly retained counsel and was exploring legal options to recover what he described as profits skimmed from our handshake deal. It was becoming clear Hogan's $220 million fortune was no longer just a family fight. It was about to turn into a free-for-all. The evidentiary hearing to determine the fate of Vince "VJ" Jensen's claim was held in the largest courtroom the Tampa courthouse could offer. Every seat was filled, family members in the front rows, reporters jammed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, and fans lining up outside just for the chance to glimpse the man who claimed to be Hulk Hogan's forgotten business partner, the judge. A no-nonsense woman with decades of experience in high-profile probate disputes made it clear from the start. This hearing was not to decide who deserved the money, but whether Jensen's claim had enough legal weight to move forward. We are here, she said firmly, to determine if this alleged agreement is enforceable under Florida law and if there is credible evidence to support its existence. Jensen's attorney went first, placing the infamous manila folder on the evidence table with almost theatrical flair. Inside was the original 1979 partnership agreement. Typed on aged paper, signed Terry G. Bollea in blue ink, with Jensen's signature below. The lawyer argued that the language, though simple, was clear. All profits derived from the name, likeness, and wrestling activities of Terry Bollea shall be shared equally between Bollea and Jensen for the duration of both parties' lives. The room shifted uneasily as the first witness was called, a retired wrestler named Iron Mike Darrow. He hobbled to the stand on a cane, adjusting his tie awkwardly. Under oath, Darrow testified that he had been in the same locker room when Hogan and Jensen first shook hands on the deal. They were talking like brothers, Darrow said. VJ told Terry, 50-50, no matter what, and Terry said, you got it, brother. That's the truth as I remember it. Next came the convention circuit witness, a former tour manager named Lisa Hanford. She testified that in 2018, during a signing event in Chicago, Hogan introduced Jensen to her as the guy who helped me start it all, and the guy I promised to take care of when the lights go out. Her voice wavered as she recalled the moment. It didn't sound like a joke, she told the court. He was serious. Then came the centerpiece, the alleged audio recordings. The judge had insisted on hearing them privately first to determine their admissibility. After a tense half-hour recess, she returned and ruled that 3 short excerpts would be played for the court. The crackling audio filled the room, Hogan's unmistakable voice coming through the speakers. Vince, brother, you know I ain't forgotten what we started. When the big payday comes, I'm making sure you're good. That's how we started, that's how we finish. The murmurs in the gallery were immediate. Brooke's lips pressed into a thin line, while Nick leaned forward, clearly savoring the moment. Jennifer, however, stared straight ahead, expressionless. It was the estate's turn next. Hogan's lead attorney moved to dismantle Jensen's credibility. First, they brought in a forensic handwriting expert who testified that while the signature on the 1979 document could be Hogan's, there were inconsistencies suggesting it may have been traced from another early autograph. Then they called a wrestling historian who pointed out that in 1979, Hogan had not yet adopted Hulk Hogan as his permanent ring name, meaning the agreement's reference to name and likeness could be argued as too vague to cover the modern brand. But the bombshell came when the estate's legal team produced Hogan's own archived business files, recovered from a storage unit in Clearwater. Inside was a 1991 legal memo prepared by Hogan's corporate attorney at the time, explicitly stating that any informal partnership with Vince Jensen is hereby null and void, following a payout of $25,000. Attached to the memo was a signed receipt bearing Jensen's signature, acknowledging the payment as final settlement of all prior business arrangements. The moment that document hit the evidence table, the courtroom seemed to freeze. Jensen's attorney immediately objected, questioning the authenticity and claiming the receipt was a forgery. But the estate's counsel was ready. They had a former paralegal from Hogan's 1991 legal team on the stand within minutes, testifying that she had personally notarized Jensen's signature on the receipt. Jensen's face went pale, but he held his ground, whispering furiously to his lawyer. His team pivoted, arguing that while the 1991 payment may have ended one specific business arrangement, it did not cover the lifetime royalty, verbal promises Hogan allegedly made in later years. They painted the audio recordings as proof that Hogan himself still believed Jensen had a stake, regardless of past settlements. By the end of the day, the judge announced she would not rule immediately, citing the conflicting and substantial evidence that required further review. She set a date 2 weeks later for her decision, a ruling that could either cement Jensen's place as a beneficiary or eliminate him entirely from the estate fight. Outside, the courthouse steps became a media free-for-all. Reporters fired questions at everyone. Brooke refused to comment. Nick smirked and muttered, "Let's see if they can bury this one." Jennifer walked briskly to a waiting car, trailed by her security, and yet, even as the court braced for the ruling, another storm was brewing. Sources close to the probate process leaked that a sealed safe from Hogan's Clearwater mansion, recently opened by estate administrators, contained a handwritten journal Hogan had kept sporadically over the last 15 years. Early whispers suggested the journal contained candid thoughts about his business relationships, including Jensen, and potentially others who had yet to step forward. If those pages were entered into evidence, they could blow the case wide open again. When the existence of Hulk Hogan's private journal leaked, it became the single most anticipated piece of evidence in the entire $220 million estate battle. For days, reporters camped outside the Clearwater storage facility where the safe had been opened, hoping for any scrap of detail. The journal, according to sources, wasn't a daily diary but a collection of sporadic entries spanning nearly 15 years, short, handwritten reflections that Hogan would jot down between tours, after major events, or during sleepless nights. The estate's administrators had discovered it in a fireproof safe tucked away in Hogan's home office, alongside old championship belts, stock certificates, and a bundle of personal letters. Bound in worn brown leather, its cover bore no title, just a faint embossing of his initials, TGB. When the judge authorized its review in chambers, only a handful of people were allowed to see it at first: the judge herself, attorneys from both sides, and a court-appointed archivist to verify authenticity. It was immediately clear the journal would not just be about money. It was personal, unfiltered, and, most importantly for the court, full of names. Some entries were short bursts of confidence and bravado. "The brand is me. As long as I'm breathing, they can't break it." Others were tinged with regret. "Every time I trust the wrong people, it costs me more than cash. It costs me pieces of myself." But scattered throughout were mentions of Vince "VJ" Jensen. Some were vague, almost casual. "Ran into VJ again. Same old story. Wants a piece. Still feels like I owe him for the early days." Others were much sharper. "V.J.'s pushing hard. I know what we agreed in the past, but I've paid him more than enough. If he thinks there's more coming, he's wrong." And then there was one entry dated 3 years before Hogan's death that froze the room when it was read aloud in court. Told VJ, "I'd make sure he's taken care of." Said it just to end the conversation. Truth is, the deal's been dead for decades. That single sentence hit Jensen's claim like a body slam. His own argument rested heavily on Hogan's alleged verbal reassurances in recent years, but here was Hogan, in his own handwriting, admitting those reassurances were lip service, not promises. The journal also contains surprises that no one had anticipated. Hogan had jotted down candid thoughts about his children's financial habits. Brooke's careful, she'll make the money grow. Nick, still worried he'll burn through it. That's why the trust stays as it is. About Linda, we've fought like hell, but she built this with me in the beginning. She deserves a cut, but not control. About Jennifer, she steadied me when I was crumbling. She'll protect the brand, but Brooke needs a seat at that table to keep it honest. And then, buried near the back, names that hadn't appeared in any will, letter, or court filing so far. Hogan had listed a few debts of honor he had never settled, including a former tag team partner from Japan, a retired gym owner in Tampa, and, cryptically, someone identified only as the Boston Kid. Find him, pay him. No amounts were listed, just the note, they deserve a slice. The moment those entries became part of the public record, the media pounced. Talk shows ran segments speculating about the mysterious Boston Kid. Wrestling historians scoured old match cards and training rosters. And the people already fighting over the estate began to see new potential threats, more claimants who might step out of the shadows, armed with just enough connection to demand a piece. For Jensen, the journal was a devastating blow. His attorney tried to argue that the deal's been dead for decades line was merely Hogan's emotional venting and didn't override decades of prior agreements. But the estate's legal team pounced on it, pointing out that Hogan had also documented his intention to cut Jensen out completely while still maintaining an outward appearance of goodwill. The judge, clearly aware of the journal's impact, ordered it to remain in evidence for the upcoming ruling on Jensen's claim. And though no decision had been made yet,